Okay, Khush, over to you.
Good afternoon to those joining from the UAE and the region. Good morning to those joining from the United States. And welcome to our discussion this morning with His Excellency Dr. Ahmad Al Falasi, the UAE Minister of State for Entrepreneurship and SMEs. My name is Khush Choksy and I'm the Senior Vice President for Middle East and Turkey at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. On behalf of the U.S. Chamber and our U.S. UAE Business Program, we are delighted to continue the discussions we've had over the past year focused on innovation in the UAE. I would like to thank the UAE Embassy here in Washington for their continued support as we host these discussions. We appreciate their valuable partnership and look forward to continuing to working together in 2022. I'm also delighted to be joined by Steve Lutes, Vice President for Middle East Affairs, and Sarah Kali, the Director of the U.S. UAE Business Program at the Chamber. I would also like to thank our two partners in the UAE, AmCham Abu Dhabi and AmCham Dubai, for their support in today's event. Over the past year, as part of our UAE Economy 4.0 webinar series, we have explored cutting-edge technologies and innovative developments taking place in the UAE that are paving the future of our bilateral economic relationship. These discussions have brought together business leaders, entrepreneurs, and investors with government officials, academia, and other stakeholders from both of our countries to further understand the policy priorities and goals and uncover areas of future cooperation. While many of these webinars have emphasized large initiatives within government and have large multinationals, the UAE is a global leader in entrepreneurship as well, ranking #1 in the Middle East and #4 globally, according to the Global Entrepreneurship Index in 2022. This, along with developing an integrated system to support and incubate entrepreneurial projects, has accelerated growth and highlighted national efforts made over the last decade to develop sectors and encourage progress. His Excellency Dr. Ahmad Al Falasi has worked very hard to solidify the UAE's position as a top destination for international investment in the Gulf and has utilized the regional competition to jumpstart entrepreneurship in the UAE. So companies
that area name is Persian Gulf
as an entry platform for growth regionally. Before I speak too much on His Excellencies and the UAE's future goals in this space, I'd like to introduce our guest of honor, Dr. Ahmad Al Falasi, Minister of State of Entrepreneurship and SMEs in the UAE, and then turn the floor to him for his remarks. Dr. Ahmad was named the minister under the new UAE government structure approved in July 2020. Under this role, His Excellency is at the fore of designing national initiatives to strengthen the UAE's SME sector, one of the engines of the national economy, and promote entrepreneurship in various industries. He is also tasked to set up strategic direction and develop a general national policy for the country's tourism sector, which, as we all know, is definitely thriving and a global destination. Before his present position, he was Minister of State for Higher Education, during which he supervised the development of higher education and scientific research in the UAE. He also formulated new policies for the sector as well as streamlined the work of higher education institutions to ensure quality outputs that match the requirements of the labor market. In October 2017, pursuant to the ministerial amendment to the UAE government, he took the responsibility of equipping UAE nationals with skills for the future. He's also the former chairman of the Federal Authority for Human Resources and chairman of the board of directors of the UAE Space Agency, an entity that we've been proud to do events with. He's also served as the CEO of Mazda Company. Many of you may remember we spoke with the current CEO earlier this year on sustainability. He not only intimately involved in the workflow issues of entrepreneurs and SMEs, but also many of the policy initiatives that we at the Chamber and many of our members work with daily, such as innovation in the economy, intellectual property, and approvals of decisions on regulatory issues in these topics. Today, After we hear from the minister, we look forward to hearing from private sector panel from their perspectives on the UAE entrepreneurial ecosystem. Your Excellency, the floor is yours. Thank you, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Khush, and thank you for hosting me in this summit. And I think what better way to participate in the Innovation Summit than to do it virtually. I think, Khush, you've delivered a great speech talking about the UAE ecosystem, so I'm not going to be repetitive what you said. But what I would like to point out to is that one of the strengths of the UAE's VC ecosystem is the diversity in the country, right? We have 200 nationalities. We're fortunate enough to be the #1 destination for graduates within the whole MENA region. There's an annual survey that's conducted by BCW Asda, and the UAE has always been ranked as the #1 place to go to work within the region. So we've been blessed to be able to attract talent because, again, entrepreneurship is all about the right talent, the right mix of talent. We have John here who was in Sharjah and Dubai, and he's now in the US and back to Dubai. It's a testament of the flow of talent. And I always say, no matter how much money you throw at a VC ecosystem, it's all about the entrepreneurs. It's very human. It's about people with great ideas. And again, we also have a great talent acquisition program right now at the federal level to see what more could we do to attract talent. And one of the tools we're using is the entrepreneurship visa or freelancer visa, where we allow people to come into the UAE without having to work for an employer. That allows mobility of intellectuals and smart people to be able to come to the UAE, test their ideas, and then hopefully make it work. The UAE has been through a long journey. I'm proud to say that the majority of the investment is private sector. There are some pockets where we had some funded funds to attract VCs to certain locations, but the majority of what has been done is mostly private sector investments. And I think according to the Magnet report in 2020, about 41% of that was actually international from outside the UAE, which is to me a testament to the maturity of the ecosystem. Now, if you look at the funding, it might be small compared to countries like the US, but compared to the region, it's quite big. So more than 50% of all VC investment in the MENA region was in the UAE. And then the deal size itself has been growing. You look at the Series A, Series B, Series C, the average deal size has been doubling to tripling in size. So that's also an indication of the maturity of the funding, as well as the number of exits that happened. We had the first Series C exit last year with Kitopi. Raising of capital. So all indications are positive. What we're trying to do right now at the ministry is to have an overarching view of the ecosystem and see where could we step in when needed. One of the key areas is the actual culture. The UAE has always been a go-to place for employment. We're now trying to change that. I've mentioned attracting talent, but there is also the grassroots development. We've just deployed 2 weeks ago a program at schools, both public and private, to get kids as young as 12 and 14 to get into entrepreneurial experiences, out-of-class experiences. I mean, you can teach kids how to create a profit and loss statement. You can teach them economics and business, but that's not a replacement for the actual experience. So we're doing that as we speak. We're also doing a nationwide pitching competition for universities. And we'll also have other programs that we're about to launch in the future for women in entrepreneurship, as well as retired people who would also look at entrepreneurship as a way of socioeconomic activity beyond retirement. I can go on, but I'm very excited to be here. I think our relationships with the US is one of the best we have across multiple fronts. You've mentioned some of the areas I've been blessed to be exposed with. I've been in space, in higher education, now in entrepreneurship. And I'm proud to say that across all three areas, we have a strong relationship with the US, across all. And I think also we have with us Jane from Stripe, who also has a US link, and we have other companies as well, who are now using the UAE as a platform to expand to the region. So even though the UAE market size is not the largest, but it really is a strong foundation for entrepreneurs to expand to the wider MENA region. So if you look at all the unicorns that came out of the UAE, it was based out of their way to be able to establish strong base in the UAE and then scale up into neighboring countries like Egypt, India, and Saudi Arabia. I'll stop there because I really think we should listen more from the private sector. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmad. Steve, let me turn it now over to you.
Thank you, Khush, and thank you, Your Excellency. Before we go to the panel, I just did want to throw a couple questions out to you, Dr. Ahmad. I have to say too, when I was 12 or 14, I had maybe a lemonade stand and a newspaper route. So what you're doing is obviously next many levels. So kudos to you in preparing, those future generations. Picking up on that last theme, when you think about U.S. companies, how can they support and participate in the development and growth of the UAE's entrepreneurial ecosystem? You mentioned using the UAE as a platform to scale across the region, but I wonder if you could flesh that out a little bit more.
So I like the lemonade example you gave, the lemonade stand. I keep saying that all the time. Part of the rich culture in the US is, selling cookies by scouts. That's a sales approach, and the lemonade stand as well is a great example. And we're trying to do that as well in the UAE. So back to your question, I think when you say, what could companies do to help support? Well, we do have 20 partnerships right now with key companies in the UAE, mostly multinational companies who operate globally and understand entrepreneurship. So these companies like, for example, Cisco is one of them, UPS is one of them. We're using them to collaborate and say, look, we will, as the ministry, identify the top 20 performing startups and SMEs, so both brick and mortar and tech startups. What could you offer on the table to help these companies scale up? So we've launched this initiative about 4 weeks ago. The UPS track has been launched. They not only offer discounted rates, but they also have a lot of investment in educating those entrepreneurs on, look, you can actually export to North America, right? And then that in itself is of great value. A lot of what we've seen today is that many entrepreneurs are quite happy being micro or being small or they're very reluctant to grow between each stages. Tech startup is a natural progression, but with your typical brick and mortar, they're quite comfortable where they are. And we need to just demystify the challenges they perceive of growing global. So that's one area that we think that companies could help by saying, look, we could have these services. Digitization by Cisco is a great one. I think the segment they're targeting is any company with a minimum revenue of 50 million dirhams, which is about, you could say, $12 million. So these are sizable companies that will be entitled to be on the program. So one element is the private sector partnership on helping SMEs grow. And the other element, I think, is also on the educational side. We've teamed up with MIT Business Forum, MIT Enterprise, to help as well universities here to understand what does it take to be an entrepreneur, right? So I think there are many ways we can do that. Even with startups in the UAE, we're trying as well to shift internship and encourage students at universities not to have a very well-structured internship at a top blue chip company, but equally important, the amount of experience you'll gain from a startup is hugely valuable. So we're also trying to do that as well. We're being a bit selective. And again, startups, they always appreciate cheap labor, but at the same time, the amount of experience the industry would gain is a lot. So I think, look, there's multiple ways. There's the funding side as well. There is the business development side, and there's also, I would call the CSR part of contributing to the culture in the UAE to create future entrepreneurs.
Thank you very much. And very interesting points, particularly on those partnerships. And I think I saw Erik on here from UPS. So when we open it up broadly, maybe he'll want to comment further on that. Last question for you, Your Excellency, before we move to the panel. We know that the UAE, has had some incredible successes with some iconic unicorns to be applauded, of course. When you think broadly about growing the startup community there in the UAE, what should we expect, from the UAE in the next 5-10 years? What is your vision?
So we've put ourselves an aspirational target by saying we need to graduate, quote unquote, 20 unicorns by 2030. I wanted to set the bar high. Again, it's not a big number, but for us, we wanted to make sure that we tackle the whole value chain. I mentioned before the scale-up program. When I say scale-up, people assume I'm talking about the Series C and Series D. And so I'm talking about scaling up from one segment to the other. So what you can expect to see is that we'll be heavily reliant on private sector partnerships. We, as I said before, have 20 partners now. We're adding 13 as we go, and this is only the first batch. I expect within 5 years, we have a platform that is by the ecosystem for the ecosystem. As government, I don't think we're the best position to help startups. But today, what we've seen is that when we get these companies to work with entrepreneurs, they see a lot of value in that, because at the end of the day, these could be potential clients in the future, or some of them actually interested in partnering with them. We had great examples where one MNC partnered with a local startup when they saw the value in that company as well. So I think, long story short, I think you'll see a large number of companies transitioning through different stages. You'll see a lot more partnerships, and hopefully see a lot more unicorns coming out of the UAE.
Your Excellency, we'd ask if you can please stay with us after we go to the panel. I think we want to come back to you and get your reflections on some of the comments and points they may have highlighted. What I'd like to do, we're going to pivot to our panel, and I want to introduce each of our three speakers and then come to them with some questions. First, let me introduce Christopher Schroeder. Christopher is an entrepreneur, advisor, investor in interactive technologies and social communications. He is the co-founder of Next Billion Ventures, a venture capital and advisory group for rising markets, backed by leaders in Silicon Valley. Christopher was the CEO and publisher of Washington Post Newsweek Interactive and co-founder of healthcentral.com. Many of you may know him as the author of the bestseller Startup Rising, the Entrepreneurial Revolution, Remaking the Middle East. Christopher, glad to have you with us. He'll be joined also by Barbara Kotschwar, and I hope I pronounced that right, Barbara, the executive director of Visa's Economic Empowerment Institute. Dr. Barbara heads a team of experts in the field of payments, economic policy, technology, and security, working to advance digital equity and inclusion, unlocking growth through trade and fostering an open future for payments. She also represents Visa on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Economic Growth and Recovery. And last but certainly not least, we're really excited. Jean, you were referenced a couple times by the minister. Jean Gauthier is the startup partner at Stripe, leading the startup ecosystem partnerships across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Earlier in his career, Jean co-founded tech startups in Dubai and raised funding from family offices and institutional investors. He founded his first startup in 2007 by launching the world's fastest PC in the Gulf. And outside of his work at Stripe, Jean is an active angel investor and founding member of several Web3 communities. So to the panel, thank you all for being with us today. And we really do appreciate you making the time to join us. Christopher, wanted to come to you first. You've seen firsthand and written about the UAE's growing entrepreneurial ecosystem. And I was wondering if you could share with us your perspective on why you think the UAE's been successful and essentially what is their secret sauce?
Well, Steve, first of all, I just want to thank you and Khush and the U.S. Chamber. You just do amazing work about global entrepreneurship, but particularly in MENA for years. And so you've been pioneers on this. And I'm deeply honored to be with this panel, and particularly Dr. Ahmed. Look, in one word, Steve, the answer is leadership. You can almost go to any country in the world now because the phenomenon of unleashing startups is happening in every country in the world now. And you can tell the difference. We in Silicon Valley like to think that the rise of startups is a bottom-up phenomenon, but the fact is the top-down is essential. And governments who've decided to show the leadership and to step in and really open up the environment, you can almost predict, like the sun setting in the west, where they're going to be in 3 to 5 years. And the UAE now for 5 to 10 years has leaned forward in this in a way which has been very encouraging, and I think a model not just to MENA, but actually to other rising markets and global players, generally speaking. Dr. Ahmed captured the 4 key elements of the playbook in a way, which is to unleash talent, which they've been doing, I think, dramatically. Not only that, they've been a network effect of talent as people around the Middle East and the UAE and the Gulf, but also everywhere in the world wants to be there. And in fact, he referred a little bit about the second element, which is about funding, and he called it the maturity of funding. I would note the maturity of talent. This is now a group of people who worked at Kareem, or they tried a bunch of startups before. They actually know how it's done. And so they're actually performing in a way at a level of sophistication early on that is going to take them, I think, to very new levels and we used to call it the PayPal effect at Silicon Valley. It's now the Kareem effect, which is being unleashed, I think, very powerfully. His emphasis on the private sector, I think, is very powerful. His emphasis on culture and education, certainly for the medium to long term, is essential. I think there's a 5th leg, I would suggest, of the table, which is what the UAE has done in the regulatory environment. They have effectively said we are open for innovation. We are open for business. You're going to understand our sandbox process. You're going to understand what it means to be a fintech company and be able to get the licensing that you need to do. It will become more predictable. And speaking solely not as an entrepreneur anymore, but as an investor, that level of support and predictability is what we strive for. We want to know at the end of the day that companies that are pitching a great idea are not going to hit the buzzsaw of regulation that they hit everywhere else. And in fact, in the UAE, it's the opposite. It's not a buzzsaw. It's really, I think, a rocket launching pad. So it's one amazing playbook.
Well, Christopher, thank you very much, and thank you for articulating those 5 keys. And very interesting that last one. It's something, as you know well, that's near and dear to the chamber: the policy, regulatory, that business operating environment, and what signal the government's sending. So absolutely critical. Barbara, wanted to come to you next. For those that aren't familiar with Visa's Economic Empowerment, we're all familiar with Visa, but for those that aren't familiar with Visa's Economic Empowerment Institute, can you give us an overview of what your focus is there at the Institute, and
sure, Steve.
And why it's germane to a discussion like today?
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me to speak on this super important panel. And thanks to His Excellency for such an enlightening presentation. I think we have a lot of food for thought. The Visa Economic Empowerment Institute is about a year and a month old now. We launched last year during the pandemic, jointly with Visa's commitment to elevate 50 million small businesses worldwide, as well as our commitment to focus on the economic and social barriers to digital success, such as closing racial and gender opportunity gaps, and also identifying regulatory and other barriers to individuals and businesses achieving their full opportunity. I think, as the minister has really pointed out, small businesses are at the heart of nearly every economy in society. And the way that those small businesses look and interact has, to a large part, changed. We've seen the transformation of digitization. What we thought would have taken years rolled into several months. And so it's wonderful to see programs such as those in the UAE and the focus on small business and innovation to really help them not only recover through the pandemic, but also to thrive. And that's something that we at the Visa Institute have been focusing on quite a bit over the past year. Our research really focuses on 3 main themes: digital equity, both on the consumer and individual side, as well as on small businesses, digital trade, which I know the Chamber does a lot of really great work on, and also Visa's bread and butter, sort of an open future for payments, looking at trends in digital payments. When we talk about economic empowerment, we're really talking about removing the structural and systemic barriers that have made it difficult for all individuals to take part in the global payments ecosystem. We aim to provide a platform for the international exchange of ideas on policy. So through wonderful speakers and thinkers such as those on this panel and in the audience. So we really welcome this opportunity. Thank you so much, Steve. I'm looking forward to sharing some insights that we had in looking at small businesses throughout the world. We're also working right now with colleagues on a survey of small businesses in Dubai, and happy to preview some of the findings there.
Thank you, Barbara. We'll definitely want to come back to you on that. That's very interesting. And thank you for the overview of the Institute's really important work that you've undertaken there. Jean, I wanted to come to you and appreciate you joining today. What do you see driving, the tech growth in the UAE and experiencing, this evolution firsthand as a startup founder? And what do you think are the proof points of the UAE's tech success?
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, I mean, speaking from a sort of former founder perspective, I launched my first business in Dubai in 2007. I had another go at it in 2014. I think it's certainly safe to say, if not an understatement, that what we've seen in terms of the growth of the tech and startup ecosystem in the UAE being exponential or logarithmic. how things progressed between 2007, 2014, and today in 2021, the ecosystem has developed tremendously. The number of startup success stories that we've seen are flat out inspirational. Like we've spoken about Kareem, there's also been Souk, who were acquired by Amazon. There was the sort of OG marketplace in Dubizzle, who were funded by Tiger Global, later, I believe, acquired by Naspers. So any number of great examples that we can speak to over the last decade. I think when we look at what's driving tech growth in the UAE, a number of great points have been made already, but I would probably double click on three factors that we think play kind of an outsized role in this. The first being really savvy consumers, right? We have 99% of UAE residents being active internet users, 92% mobile penetration rates, and the kind of accompanying infrastructure to enable this trend. In Etisalat, we have determined by speed test that we actually have the fastest mobile network in the world. And that's a digital success story in of itself. I remember signing up as an Etisalat user about 25 years ago. I still have my OG, the early Etisalat users, because of the prefix that they have in front of their phone number, and it's the 050 number. And although I'm not living in Dubai at the moment, I'm making sure that I preserve that number so that when I return, everyone knows that I was there in the early days. So to see how they've progressed on an infrastructure front is also tremendously impressive. I think the second thing that I would call out and double down on is something also His Excellency has spoken to, and Chris as well, which is the entrepreneurial culture amongst the local population and amongst folks who've been attracted to Dubai and have arrived in the UAE and have chosen to build their businesses there. Surveyed in the Arab Youth Survey, we see that the 55% of people in the 18 to 24-year-old age bracket have said that they want to own a business. Founders, we know in the MENA region, are younger than elsewhere in the world. I think the average age range is 30 to 35 versus 45 and plus elsewhere. And barriers to starting businesses are continuously coming down. That's something that we see being the government leading the charge, but we also see the private sector enabling things and really kind of adopting a user-focused mindset to think how we can make things easier for businesses. I think to speak to a Stripe example on that front, when we launched in the UAE in May of this year, we wanted to make sure that businesses would be able to avail our self-serve model. So if you're a founder or business owner in the UAE and you've just incorporated, you have your trade license, you have your bank account, you can arrive on stripe.com and without speaking to anyone, you can create a Stripe account so you can start accepting payments online and you're ready to go in a matter of hours. So, I think in the past where founders were used to, from a payments partner perspective, having to have a little bit of a back and forth with running around and paperwork, etc. This is something that we've tried to look at in terms of streamlining, and the government have been incredible partners in collaborating with us to enable this in the UAE. And on that point, there's probably also a few things to speak to in terms of their initiatives. Right, we have no shortage of programs that have looked to enable the local talent pool. There is, for example, the 1 Million Arab Coders platform, the Wajihni internship and summer program, the Ibtikhar platform, national program for AI. So the program's enablement is being set up and driven by the government, as well as the physical infrastructure, right? Accelerators and incubators available, Area 2071, Hub 71, DIFC FinTech Hive, from the private sector as well, Astrolabs, semi-governmental institutions like In5. So if you're a founder today looking to set up in the UAE, there's kind of support and enablement no matter where you turn to and no matter what stage of the process you're at, whether you are a business expanding into the UAE, whether you are a UAE-born startup looking to expand out of the UAE as well. And to speak very briefly to your question of, what we see as one of the most exciting markers of success, I think, we've spoken about what we see on the investment front, but one of the most exciting data points that we have at Stripe is actually in relation to a product that we have called Atlas, which allows businesses in the UAE, or in fact, anywhere in the world, to incorporate a Delaware C Corp. And the reason that they would want to do that is, of course, to enter the US market, to sell to US consumers, maybe to raise investment from US-based investors. And in the UAE, we see the second highest adoption rate in the world of Stripe Atlas, which is indicative to us that founders building businesses in the UAE have a global vision. They're building a business out of the UAE and they want to sell to consumers and users around the world. And that's why they would use a tool like Stripe Atlas. So it's been exciting for the last 10 years, but I think it only continues to become more exciting given the momentum that has been built up in the startup ecosystem to date.
Well, Jean, a lot of great information there, and really appreciate your perspective. And what an interesting note to end on there with Stripe Atlas and the UAE being number 2 in the globe, to avail themselves of that platform. So very, very interesting. Christopher, coming back to you, I know obviously you're working and engaging in rising markets beyond the UAE, beyond the Middle East, all around the globe. And when you look at through that lens of the other emerging rising markets, what is instructive for you here? What comes to mind for you?
Well, just a quick observation on John's great comments before me. First of all, when you think about what the UAE does as a government and what Stripe does as a business, it's like they get up in the morning, go to bed at night, trying to figure out how to take friction out of the lives of entrepreneurs. And I think Sean is being a little bit modest, because the fact is what they've done with the Atlas program, but in their business writ large, is effectively going the entrepreneurial ecosystem and saying, what can we do to get stuff out of your way? And in a way, that's the way I think it's been with the UAE as a government, which I think is very powerful. The second thing he noted was that there's a revolution in customers. And I think particularly we shouldn't lose track that COVID has accelerated that in a massive way right now, whether it's the ability to buy and sell things for the first time, whether it is moving to mobile money more rapidly, whether it's taking courses and training yourself in a new way, whether it's having the security to have healthcare in your own house on your phone. Like, this is a revolution, not just in technology, but customer behavior, which is accelerating all this in a very powerful way. To your question, look, I mean, as I said before, what is happening now in UAE and the Middle East is happening across Southeast Asia and Latin America. Now Africa is rising. Some extraordinary things happening in Pakistan right now. It's happening everywhere because technology is everywhere and talent is everywhere. The distinguishing factor is whether or not the top-down gets it, understands it, and leads on it. You, again, can almost predict where that plays out. And what is amazing to me is places that you don't necessarily expect it, particularly in the areas of fintech, have government really leaning in to meet with entrepreneurs and to meet with venture capitalists and to meet with the community, not merely to jam them into existing banking regulation, but to actually create new regulations and a new platform for the pure act of unleashing them. And this is where the multiplier effect of fintech being unleashed, financial inclusion really at its essence being unleashed, means that we're just in the early days of what's going to happen to make a lot of people's lives better and not just broader customers overall. Now, what I conclude with is, what is interesting is if you look at Southeast Asia and Latin America, they're not only a slew of unicorns there, but now decacorns. I mean, this has been an amazing leap in the last 5 years there. And I look at that as indicative of what we will be talking about when you have a panel with us in 5 years. I think we're going to see the Middle East just being completely toe-to-toe with that, with a broad definition. And as Jean and Barbara both allude to, in a global sense, not just merely thinking them as regional leaders, but in fact, global leaders.
Well, Chris, that really puts it in perspective. You know, when you think about putting it on that, in that rising up there with the global, with that global perspective, and really appreciate your thoughts on that. And thank you for furthering, some of the comments that Jean had. Really good stuff. Barbara, I wanted to come to you. So there's been you've heard from the minister on, some of their plans and priorities. I think we've had a good discussion on this, and would love for you to speak further about, the initiatives and some of the best practices at the Institute that you think would be applicable, to what's happening here in the UAE.
So I think it's been mentioned the savviness of the consumer in the UAE, and we're certainly seeing that at Visa as well. where in this market, we've seen the adoption of contactless really quickly. And we have over 80% of merchants adopting contactless payments, which is a great development for those businesses that have done that, and a testament to the consumers who can express their preferences, as well as government facilitating this. When we look at sort of the range of businesses that have been able to take advantage of digitization, that's really been, in the course of our research, identified, and this will come as no surprise to anybody here, as one of the major factors in small business, particularly small business success. To the extent that in studies that we've undertaken across the developing world and even in the United States and now in other markets, small businesses kind of across the board identify assistance in digitization as more important than getting grants and loans. And I think countries that have really increased that capacity, that have access to internet for small businesses, that have training programs, are really helping their businesses move forward. We're also looking, I think we've talked a lot about financial inclusion, and if we think about groups that traditionally haven't been digitized, we're still seeing some evidence of women-owned businesses being less digitized than men-owned businesses, and older businesses less digitized than the newer startups, of course. And what we found is that helping these businesses digitize can really also have a tremendous impact on sort of digital trade success. In our study in the United States, for example, we found that women-owned startups tend to, once they start exporting through digital platforms, tend to export to more markets and to more diverse markets, which gives them a greater reach and more opportunities. And so also having the proper policies in place to enable trade and to enable that reach into other markets, like the UAE certainly is doing, both in terms of their focus on trade and investment, is really, really important for small businesses.
Very interesting on how digitization is an enabler, particularly for, as you cited, the women-owned small businesses and others, and aspiring for a more inclusive economy, and how it's really important to have that regulatory environment that opens the door to avenues for trade or markets beyond your domestic market. So critical. And thank you for some of those insights, and we really look forward to seeing what's next for Visa and the Institute. Jean, coming to you, you've touched on some of this, but would really like for you to drill into what has been, the Stripe experience, given that you literally just launched in the UAE earlier this year. How has it gone, and any learning notions?
Thanks, Steve. It's gone phenomenally well. Stripe's launch in the UAE, it's one of our most successful launches ever. We're at a point now where we're seeing thousands of new businesses signing up on Stripe, creating accounts every week. And those businesses are making millions of dollars every day, processing over Stripe's infrastructure. I think much of this is really testament to the local ecosystem, the quality, the caliber of startups that already exist, but also the rate at which new startups are being formed. And what we typically see in terms of Stripe adoption is it's the most tech-forward and digitally enabled businesses that like to use Stripe, that like to partner with us. And so the rate at which we see Stripe being adopted is indicative of the type of new businesses that are launching in the UAE. These are very innovative businesses. They've got interesting business models. There are hundreds of new fintechs, for example, building out of Dubai, building out of Abu Dhabi. And at Stripe, we're building an infrastructure layer, enabling other fintechs to build on top of. So we're thrilled with how the UAE launch has gone. Putting my former founder hat back on, I know that I and many others were many other founders were part of the long sort of waiting list for Stripe to enter the UAE. And I had wished that Stripe was available in the earlier years where I was building my startup. So, I mean, it's a tremendous feeling now to be on this side of the table, so to speak, at Stripe, and being able to offer solutions to founders who they want to build great businesses and deliver solutions to their customers, and really not have to think or worry about their payments partner and their financial stack. And it comes back to the great point that Chris made earlier, and that Barbara has made as well, regarding digitization and breaking down barriers. So we see ourselves leaning in and playing a role on that front. And the reason that we're able to do that in large is due to the great ecosystem that exists in the UAE, and the roles that others have played in enabling that.
Well, Jean, thank you very much. And it's great to hear how successful the launch has been in the UAE, and congratulations. It's obviously, it's your team, but it's also, as you said, it's your partners, it's those in government. There's a lot of stakeholders. So well wishes for continued success. And I have to say, we really do enjoy working with our friends at Visa in the UAE as well. Your Excellency, wanted to pull you back into this conversation, Dr. Ahmad, and see if you had any reflections on anything that you've heard from the panel. And I also wanted to ask you, I think Christopher got us started on the notion, but has there been, how has the pandemic impacted your plans? I think we've all felt it to varying degrees, some on a personal level, but certainly on an economic level. So would love to hear your thoughts on that and any reflections that you have, from our panelists.
I mean, look, the pandemic has been a blessing for the UAE. I'm not going to talk about the adoption or the increased adoption of technology, both on consumers, governments, and business, but I'll also talk about a different angle that made UAE even more appealing for entrepreneurs. As you know, when the pandemic first started, the UAE took a decision to invest heavily in the healthcare system. And after that, there was investment in testing and then in vaccinations. Today, as we speak, 100% of the eligible population has received at least one dose. And I believe we've reached 81% being fully vaccinated. That's the highest globally. I think that in itself gave a sense of confidence to investors, to large corporations, and to entrepreneurs. So that, I think, in a way, brought the UAE into the global map even larger than before. We are, as we speak, are witnessing large corporations moving their locations from certain parts of East Asia, where the restrictions were higher, were required to quarantine for 2 to 3 weeks. So that in itself was a blessing. Increased number of tourists as well during this pandemic. So I think, if anything at all, beyond the obvious advantages of increased adoption of technology, which in virtue of adoption, you increase the likelihood of usage, you increase the likelihood of a tech startup company to have a exponential growth. You also have the livelihood and the attraction of further investors as well as entrepreneurs. Again, for us, the impact in numbers is as follows. If you look at the past 4 years, the average investment of VC investments in the UAE has been more or less around $500 million, plus or minus 100. This year alone, up until Q3, we've reached, I believe, $100 million. We're expecting to close at over $1.2 billion. So we've really doubled the amount of investment. We've doubled the amount of investment we've received in the VC space. So I think all in all, the overall adoption that everybody has benefited from globally, the overall positioning of the UAE as a safe hub to do business. We didn't go into full lockdown except once in Dubai for a short period. We've always been open to business. And thirdly, the outcome of that is the increased investment flow coming into the UAE. And I think where I stand today, I'm very positive about the future. We've seen the regulation changes that have happened over the past year or two. We've also seen the projects of the 50. So giving our 50th anniversary, there's several projects being launched. There have been 40 different regulations that have been reviewed. So we really are going back to the drawing board because COVID not only was a pandemic, but it also coincided with our 50th anniversary, where we are now looking back at our regulations, looking back at what we should be focusing on. And I always tell my fellow ministers, we need to now change from being a trade hub to become an entrepreneurial hub. I think the UAE is actually going around that route. So we're very positive, and I think we expect a larger adoption of of technology and a larger uptake when it comes to entrepreneurs coming into the UAE.
Well, thank you, Your Excellency. Really, really important point. You know, that pivot from it. I think, but I will say, I think you can do both. I think you'll do both and do them both well. I did want to mention, I see Erik Churchill here on screen from UPS, and give him a chance to chime in. Because, the minister referenced UAE UPS as one of those partnerships. Erik, would you want to speak to, you know, the UPS experience for that partnership?
Absolutely. Steve, thank you so much. Steve and Khush, this is a fantastic panel. Your Excellency, thank you for being with us today. I mean, UPS is really proud to have our headquarters in the UAE, our regional headquarters, and to partner with your ministry with the SME Exporters Academy. I wanted to make two really quick points that I feel like all the panelists and Your Excellency, you touched on today. One is that none of this works. The SMEs can't get off the ground without a whole of government approach to regulations. From UPS's side, we see this with trade facilitation, and we know how much the UAE has invested in that. But trade facilitation alone doesn't cut it, right? It's going to take support from the Ministry of Economy and the Ministry for SMEs, right? It's going to take those other regulatory supports that allows that ecosystem to function on all cylinders. The second point I wanted to make, which Your Excellency, you talked about, and I think was so important, and Barbara, you mentioned this as well, is this kind of whole of society approach to SMEs. And it's the examples that Jean and Christopher gave on the unicorns are amazing, but it's also the retiree who has a great idea and needs some support to get off the ground. And we know that UAE's economy, the exports have diversified so much in the last decade, just well beyond commodities, and that's because of this kind of approach, where if you are seeing each and every business as an opportunity, no matter their size, there is so much potential. And I think that's what UPS sees on the ground there, and so just wanted to thank Your Excellency for that support, and just echo what the rest of the panel has said, which is that's the key for the 21st century economy in the UAE. And
well, Erik, thanks for those comments, and the role that UPS is playing, in the economic growth and success there in the United Arab Emirates. I want to thank our panel, Christopher, Barbara, Jean. Thank you for your contributions today, but more importantly, for the work that you're doing that has preceded us and will live long after us. And we do look forward, to perhaps having you all back. Christopher, you mentioned 5 years, maybe even next year. We'll look to have a check-in sooner than this. Your Excellency, I want to turn it back to you and to Khush, to close us out. And I'd mention to those that offered questions, comments in the chat, we'll work through those, send those that we should onto our friends in the UAE government, and any that we can take care of in-house, myself or Sarah will come back to you. So Your Excellency, coming back to you for any final thoughts, reactions, and then Khush to close us out.
I mean, look, I think the panelists did a great job of discussing all the main points. It's tough to put closing remarks when everything has been said. The only thing I would say is that we are extremely positive about 2022. We have our economic projections. We've seen the projections on the entrepreneurship and the VC side. So we remain extremely excited. And I think, as I said before, as we work with the likes of UPS and potentially these and other companies, I think that will go a long way in terms of really exciting entrepreneurs to see how easy it is to scale up. I remember I spoke to Magnus, who happened to be a colleague of mine when I was at McKinsey. He told me today that it's far more easier, 10 times more easier today to scale up a company than it was when he first started. So I think it's getting easier now to start a company. It's getting easier to scale up. You've mentioned the Kareem effect, where you have people who are experienced, they know what needs to be done. We have much more sophisticated investors, and we have the attraction of entrepreneurs. So I think all boxes are checked. What we just need to do right now is to ensure as government that we do have a sounding board and we consistently engage with the sector. This is one of the great platforms that we can take. I'm happy to be taking questions. And again, it's an ongoing project. There's no end to it. We'll have to stay remaining agile. That's one of the benefits of the UAE. that we're always working an iterative process. And I think, as you said, regulation can make or break a company. And that's where we think it's an added advantage of the UAE. So thank you all for hosting me, and I wish you all the best.
Just in closing, to thank Dr. Ahmad again for joining us today. And I think the UAE is unique in the Middle East in that, unlike just having the traditional large American companies, I think that where we, the US Chamber, can work together with the AmChams in Abu Dhabi and Dubai is to look to bring to that relationship, the bilateral relationship and the innovation that American companies bring and UAE companies bring to grow the smaller, medium-sized and smaller company sector. And I think that that's where the evolution of this commercial relationship has to be. So we are happy to have worked today with you, and we look forward to the continued partnership in 2022. And we thank the panel, and we thank everyone for joining. Thank you, Steve. We'll now adjourn.